Quarles engages the world from a position that is multiply situated. As a queer, cis-born woman, born to a Black father and a white mother, her project is informed by her daily experiences with ambiguity. She seeks to dismantle assumptions of our fixed subjectivity through images that challenge the viewer to contend with the disorganized body in a state of excess. We discussed finding beauty where others might not notice, the impact of our ancestors, the importance of slowing down and doing less. Thank you so much for doing this.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me to be on the podcast.
So I am at your house. I'm actually at your studio, which is behind your house. And it is really beautiful and lush and filled with plants. And I guess I'd love to start with asking you about the environment that you like to make art in and how that impacts your mental state or your happiness or...
Yeah, I just recently bought a house with a bunch of outdoor space. And when I was house hunting, I was primarily looking for a space where I could relocate my studio back onto my home property, which was the situation at my previous place. But then I very quickly outgrew the studio, which was just the converted garage behind the house, which is very similar to the studio that we're in right now. But the goal is to have a bigger studio soon on this property. But I really am inspired just by every little thing that I see. Like I spent the first summer after grad school in a cow pasture at Skowhegan making art. And I was like determined not to make a painting about a cow while I was there. But then I did end up making a lot of paintings where these sort of planes of sky and planes of grass started to come into the work. So, and now I use that all the time in my work. So I do find inspiration just from the things I see every single day. So I try to surround myself with things that are visually interesting and beautiful. But to me, that can be also like strip malls in Los Angeles and crazy hand-painted signs around the city. So it's not just flowers and nature that I find inspiring, but I try to find a peaceful place to work whenever I can.
It's nice. So I recently participated in this exercise with some friends of mine about figuring out what our core values were. Mm-hmm. And apparently there are only like 28 core values that exist in the world. And everyone, has 3 that are the most important to them.
Oh.
Yeah, it's a really interesting exercise. And my number 1 value is appreciation of beauty.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, then you're in the right profession, right?
I think so. And I love things that are beautiful.
Yeah.
And I love that you said that that's one of the things that you look for.
Yeah, I think that finding beauty sort of in the oddities or like idiosyncrasies of the world too, and finding sort of beauty in something that's just visually engaging. So oftentimes I find beauty in things that people are like, what? That's the thing that inspires you? But I mean, even here, I just recently moved into the studio and there's already all my weird little knickknacks. Like you should definitely check out the bathroom because there's all these fun, strange, like, fruit posters and dolls that my great grandmother owned of these like Caribbean colonial dolls situations. And like, I have like a LeVar Burton mug behind you and like a crazy crab that my mom got me for Christmas. So yeah, just finding kind of beauty in the strangeness of the world. Yeah. But I think artists are always, that we're such trained observers. So always observing things.
I love that you brought up your grandmother because my grandmother was a huge influence on me too.
Oh yeah.
Tell me, if you would, about yours.
Well, actually, so this is my great-grandmother's doll, who I didn't know really growing up, but she was pretty cool. She was like best friends with Lena Horne and was like this, Black real estate kind of tycoon in Chicago in the early part of the 20th century. So yeah, she's really cool, but I didn't know her. Yeah. I knew her husband really well because he died when he was 100 and grew up in the South Side of Chicago his whole life. And And yeah, I usually keep his picture up in my studio, but I'm looking for just the right thumbtack to put it up with.
Yeah.
But yeah, I was definitely also, I mean, I'm still close with my grandmother, my father's side, who's still alive, and she was an anchor woman for many years for NBC and CNN, and was like one of the first Black anchor women, and just super inspiring to me.
Yeah, it's so interesting to find these legacies of female entrepreneurs.
Yeah.
From, a couple of generations ago. It's not that common.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I was really inspired growing up around so many kind of powerful women, but women who were able to sort of make an interesting life out of very little um, resources. I mean, my grandmother, she was born in the early to mid part of the 20th century,
Yeah.
And was born to immigrant parents from Trinidad, and was a single mom with two young kids, and then was able to become an anchor woman in a building where the only other Black person in the whole building was a mailman at 30 Rock. So it was like pretty incredible. I thought that she could do that. So growing up with that kind of legacy, you're like, okay, I can maybe be an artist. Why not?
Yeah. It's, I don't know. I don't want to talk too much about myself, but it is a conversation, so I'll show up for it also. My grandmother had immigrant parents also, and her parents were furriers, and she was allergic to mink, so they sent her to an orphanage when she was 8.
Oh my God.
And
wow.
and so that was the last that she got to go to school, and
Wow.
she could come home on the weekends. But anyway, she married my grandfather and got into real estate herself, and that's how she started to collect art. She would buy places that
Oh, wow.
had art in them. And my parents don't like art, and I grew up around all this art without any stories.
Oh,
And
interesting.
when I decided I wanted to pursue a career in art, my parents were like, "You can't do that," and she said she'd support me for a year.
Oh, wow.
So having this, and just recently I realized, how important that. What a great guide she was for me, and how she really facilitated so much.
Yeah. No, I think that there's so much credit that needs to be given to people that can support you and give you a safety net in areas that you otherwise would. I mean, I think everyone needs some sort of a safety net, and there just happens to be a lot of safety nets for certain types of people. And
Yeah.
that there's like, I'm really grateful that I grew up in a family where I could, even if we didn't always have money, there was always this sort of cultural safety net of people that really valued creativity and art, and having like strong female role models in my family, and
Yeah.
these people that sort of paved the way of having this idea sort of collect in my subconscious, like, okay, I can do this. And I think that's sort of like what ends up leading to a lot of the a lot of the people that maintain positions of power and privilege. Part of that power and privilege is having those sort of ingrained safety nets
Yeah.
that are usually passed down to like the wealthy straight white American men in this country. But yeah, it's exciting that more and more people are being able to be given that chance.
And I mean, I think that's one of the reasons why I wanted to do these kinds of conversations too, is, to give voice to things that often remain unsaid, right?
Sure.
And so, and if people don't tell their stories, particularly unexpected stories, or the things that maybe people have hidden because they're seen as a hindrance or whatnot, then there's it. I guess it's just by way of saying that I think it's important to tell stories, not just for ourselves, but for other people, because hearing someone's story then provides a space or an opportunity, or I don't even like the psychic guidance for someone to be brave in a different circumstance.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's very true. I think there's also, especially in places like the art world, there's sort of a lot of mysticism and mystery wrapped around it, and a lot of ideas that there's, genius, and there's this sort of like subjective truths that are not really tangible. They just sort of are these like ethereal good works of art and brilliant artists, and that actually that that sort of mystifies the situation and sort of continues this idea that only certain types of people can make art, because there's actually there actually are, like, I think a lot of tangibles and like a lot of things that you can break down the process of art making into, like a lot of practice and a lot of access to certain moments in your life of being able to have access to education or access to just the time to, put in those 10,000 hours of making something.
Yeah.
And that sort of, I think it's really important to kind of add more transparency, because then you'll inadvertently just have more voices come into the conversation.
I think that's right. And I think part of that is creating a safe space for people to look at things that make them initially uncomfortable because they don't understand it, right?
Yeah.
And so however the process gets demystified, whether it's for making or for looking,
Yeah.
right? I think that's one of my goals.
Yeah, I think that's one of the exciting things about like a curatorial practice, and why I love talking with curators and working with curators is because there can be it's a different way. I mean, there often is language incorporated into exhibitions and catalogs, but I think that curators can bring together a thesis or an idea through like visual juxtapositions within the work, and that's really how artists think through work anyway. And it's sort of, I do feel like it's like stripping away some of the language can add to people being invited into conversations they wouldn't otherwise have, or seeing ideas from a different perspective that would be like, oh, well, this is like a Black female perspective, so it's not mine, so I'm going to be looking at it from the outside. But if you're presented with it visually, you can be kind of brought into a conversation rather than being positioned outside of it.
Exactly. And sometimes you can not trick someone to come into the conversation,
right.
but almost, right?
Yeah. Well, and I think that's like, I mean, with my paintings, I use a lot of beauty within them as that sort of way of sort of coercing people into a conversation that they either wouldn't really want to have, or that they maybe wouldn't want to spend as much time contemplating. But I think there's certain ways you can ease people into a conversation through beauty, but then kind of have them talk about something that they maybe would have been like, oh, I didn't know that this was my place to talk about that.
Yeah.
But then also using beauty as a way to also be this like moment of like respite or relief for people that have to have a difficult conversation every single day. So I think that there's actually like a lot of substance to beauty, or it can be.
Yeah. I really like that idea of the generosity of beauty, right? That it serves multiple purposes, and to create a space where it gives people a respite, right? Is inherently super generous.
Yeah, I mean, because I think that, there's sort of, it's easy to sort of write off beauty as being frivolous, or but I wonder, maybe that's like just like a very like American, like capitalist kind of way of thinking through things, that like there shouldn't be this sort of space where you can mull things over and let your mind sort of wander, or like take refuge just sort of in beauty as a way to also access. It's like the way that you can have, like you can use humor sometimes as like a way to tell something more difficult. You can do it through humor, and it's kind of easier to take.
Absolutely. There's so much power in that. As you were talking, I was just thinking about, who's threatened by beauty, right? And maybe that's why for a while, somehow beauty was kind of thrown to the side, or, diminished, or, and I'm finding over time the ability to take back things that truly have, power and impact, that when you sit with it and you're honest about it, instead of just believing, the broad-based, what's been communicated.
Yeah.
Right? So,
yeah. No, and I think too about like how certain things, like certain stories in history too, and even like looking back, there can be a tendency to sort of reinforce certain narratives that are not necessarily generative for like a present moment of looking, when you kind of discount like the celebration and the beauty and sort of the perseverance that can come through very difficult moments in certain histories. And by only sort of remembering difficulties through difficult presentations, that can kind of reinforce that sort of narrative, and the different roles that sort of led to that situation can actually be reinforced when you discount actually like the power and the presence of beauty and joy and perseverance and celebration. And not to say that, and just to not discount that as being one dimensional. Like when I refer to beauty, it's always kind of in that complicated way.
Of course, and it feels really empowering to be able to decide, what it is you want to claim.
Yeah.
So,
definitely.
So, there's a painting hanging on the wall here in your studio, and we're doing a podcast, semi-started. Would you describe what's happening in the painting for our listeners?
Sure.
What it looks like,
well, it's the very early stages of a painting. Mm-hmm. So this is like an afternoon of work going into a painting, and the way that I start my work. So they're always, if you're not familiar with the paintings, they tend to have the figure, sometimes multiple figures, sometimes sort of a single figure moving through the time and space of the canvas. And there's oftentimes, I would say there's more these sort of fragmented parts of the body that coalesce into figures, but there's oftentimes the amount of hands or feet or arms don't really add up to a discernible number of figures. So, and then there tends to be either like a still life element or a patterned plane or an architectural reference that contextualizes, but then also fragments the figures within the piece. And they are always acrylic paint on raw canvas ground. So that's sort of the, the umbrella story of them. But what's happening in this piece right now, in its very early stages, I will start off with a raw canvas and sort of no predetermined sketches or ideas of what I'm going to paint in the piece, kind of knowing it's going to roughly take the form of what I just described. Mm-hmm. And it starts off very, I approach it much more abstractly. It's much more through physical brushstrokes and sort of the memory of drawing the figure, because I'll still take figure drawing classes, but I'll try to resist the urge of completing the image that I will start off painting. So I'll leave it really fragmented and spend a lot of time looking at the work, because I tend to have a pretty quick hand. So I'll slow down my process by looking at the work and thinking about different ways that I could connect these initial strokes. And so it's sort of, I will often say that it's sort of like looking at clouds in the sky and trying to like find images in the clouds. So I'll do that with my own work when I look at it, just as a way to sort of challenge myself to do a different composition or have the figure connect in a way that I wouldn't have done if I had just been doing all my thinking through making. And so from there, pretty quickly, though, the figures do start to get worked out. So right now on this piece, there's like, what did I say there is? There's definitely like 2 nipples and like starting to be the formation of 4 different hands. No, 5 hands, actually. And there's 3 faces, but only one of them is really made with a high contrast use of paint. So that's the one that's kind of coming across. But I know that there's a paint to, there's like a blue nose, sort of profile. Yeah. But to the right of that face, there is a very vague face that's
with
on
the
there.
Yellow?
Yeah. And then there's, some sort of like fleshy thighs and this little kind of, it's either sort of like a cold sun or a bright moon in the background. So it's this very sort of, I always do sort of, even though the works are not meant to be narrative, I will narrate what I'm looking at to myself as I paint it. So at this stage, this very early stage, I've sort of started to narrate this as being like a very heroic sort of image, because there's this sort of like...
It does feel like that.
Yeah. I even like, and I'll write down notes to myself as I make the painting that will sometimes go into the titles. And I always look for sort of like puns or jokes or
Mm-hmm.
so actually all my notes, I started making this painting I have an upper barn on this property, so I started painting up there, and then it got too cold and rainy, so I brought it down here. So like the notes I have are like westward ho, but like ho is being like
H-O-E.
like a
Yeah.
hoe.
Yeah.
And just kind of like, making little jokes. I tend to keep those sort of dumb jokes in my drawings, but with the paintings, I kind of work through just how kind of silly I'll be with the titles. But
Well, it's interesting because like as I was looking at it, and currently there's a lot of white space, which is oftentimes, a significant element of your compositions also.
Yeah.
And in this work, when I was looking at it, I currently see, and I know it's evolving, but a heroic female figure, and I was thinking about like a winged victory,
Oh yeah.
and
Yeah,
because
exactly.
it seems like she has a lot of motion, and it's almost as if maybe because of the angles of where it is currently, it almost seems as if she's like has a lot of forward momentum and almost like she could be sort of taking off,
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And it's one of the helpful things of not having a sketch going into a painting. Like some people are like, oh, aren't you intimidated by having a raw canvas? I'm like, oh no, it's great because I can't, like you can't mess up when you start because
Right.
you're not trying to make it look like anything.
Yeah.
You're just really reacting to what happens and then finding the opportunities to flesh out things that are interesting. So I do spend like a lot of, and one of the reasons why I'm happy about being in this very tiny studio, my old studio, which I still have, is like, I don't know, 5 times the size of this. So one of the things I'm excited about working from home again and working in the smaller space is being able to really do some extended periods of looking at work throughout the day rather than having it be like, well, I drove to the studio and so I better put in like 8 hours right now. And this will allows me to really just sort of look at the work and narrate it. But I mean, I'll take opportunities that start to develop through the piece developing to then emphasize that in the patterns and the planes, which always come later. So that'll be like probably a little bit longer of working on this. I'll photograph it and bring it into the computer and play on Illustrator with the different planes and still life possibilities. And that's a way of continuing to have that sort of free play with the composition, but not actually lay down paint, so I can still have those areas of raw canvas.
Yeah.
But yeah, since there is sort of this like heroic pose beginning, I'll probably either rein that in or really go all the way into it.
Yeah. So this space feels intimate, it feels human scaled, in a way. It doesn't feel domestic, but it feels intimate. And maybe it's, the carpet or the height of the ceiling or, something like that. But I've been thinking a lot about this idea of slowing things down. And I've been using that as sort of a personal mantra.
Yeah.
And I love the image of you kind of, walking in and out, right? And I came in through your front door, and then we walked in here, and the doors are open, and there's this kind of I think like physical openness, which seems to, and for me, as I'm thinking and looking, I also sort of need to move,
Right.
Because I like to see things from different angles, right? I like to get closer and like sit here and look at it, and then I would probably like stand over there and look, and that's how I've always done exhibition making too. Is I want to see everything from every angle.
Yeah.
Because I think there's like a logic to it.
Definitely. Yeah.
So, but and you talked about how you have kind of a quick hand, and so I'm interested to hear about that sort of push pull, right, between like what you could do, right, which is be fast,
Exactly.
And then like restraint.
Yeah, and with the work, I mean, I'm actually really excited to go back to this sort of smaller studio space, just since, I mean, I think regardless of what you do, your environment has an impact on how you think and how you kind of come up with ideas and brainstorm. And so I'm really looking forward to having sort of the physical restraints of this space while also having the openness of having a longer duration in which I can come back to the work, because I can come back at any time of the day or night and look at it. And then just sort of having this like larger like sense of outdoor space at this new location that's also contained, which gives me sort of like more, I can go out like, you know, in my slippers and a big t-shirt and don't have to worry about it because it's my backyard. But but I do think that there's sort of this idea where it's like, you know, everything has to be like bigger and bigger and bigger and crazier. And I was starting to work really quite large in the last several paintings I made my two largest stretched canvases, because I also make these giant installations, which are huge.
Yeah.
And have actually, the piece I made for the hammer was in a space the same size as this space. And it was insane to make that. I don't know what that was. It was like 20 by 30 foot painting in a space of like a garage. I was working on the whole thing. I was working on vertical panels horizontally. So I was working on them on their side and then like photographing them and bringing them back into the computer and stitching them to be correctly oriented. So that's too much restraint. That was just hard.
That seems like unnecessary.
That was definitely like I need a bigger space. Then I got this bigger space and I started making these paintings I've been making over the last year, which have been getting sort of more and more intricate and kind of crazy, and these really large stretch canvases. And so I'm looking forward to not necessarily scaling anything back, but just seeing what will inevitably shift by just having a closeness and like an intimacy to the work, and sort of slowing down the process just for a period of time while I'm building a bigger studio and can go back to it being crazy. But I do think that having that closeness to your work, it just changes the way you see certain things. And I do still, I mean, even in a large space, I will often I always have carpet in my studio because I like to just kind of like lie on the floor and look at the work. And I do make a lot of the decisions up close, and then I make a lot of other decisions from far away. So I continue to move back and forth.
Yeah, the push-pull. Yeah, I think proximity is really, it can't be underestimated, right? And you know, some people are not comfortable being close to things and people and whatever, you know, but I'm big on proximity. I'm like, let's come right in here, you know, let's like sit down, let's, you know, be close, let's talk, you know. Do you know about the marshmallow experiment?
Oh yeah, I love that. With those kids.
Yeah. I was just shown that video again last week, and it's so funny, you know. But I've been thinking a lot about that. You know, like, what does that mean to say no initially, right? Without, I mean, they knew that if they said no to the one marshmallow, they were going to get two, you know. But sometimes you say no to something that you want in the short term for something that comes in the long term, right? Yeah. But maybe that's an unknown thing.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think there is sort of something to not always doing the biggest, most craziest thing that you can.
Exactly.
Not always moving up is the right way to go. Sometimes it makes sense to get smaller, quieter, or more still with the work. And yeah, it was funny, like in grad school, it's like always this kind of joke in the painting department, because it was like everyone just had bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger paintings. And that was actually the first time I made one of those giant wall installations, because I was like, I'm going to have the biggest painting in the thesis show at Yale.
Yeah.
But I think there's actually, I mean, I think it's really challenging to make a good small painting. Like I work in a pretty physical way. So everything sort of, even though my canvas sizes will range quite a bit from like a few feet wide to being like 14 feet wide, the figures are all made sort of with this, I think of it as like a shoulder movement. So the scale of the figure is consistent throughout the work. So it's really just a way of changing the composition and changing the, again, sort of like the restraints of the actual boundaries of the canvas will determine the composition. So I tend to not be able to go much smaller than a 40 by 50 inch canvas, but I think that like a really good small painting is incredible to look at.
Yeah. You know, I've been thinking a lot about this notion of simplicity, right? And how simple things are often the hardest,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because if there's more complexity to things, like there are other spaces to hide.
Yeah.
But, if you just break it down,
Mm-hmm.
then whatever it is, it is.
Yeah. No, I think that, yeah, there's a lot to being simple. Though I've actually been recently really trying to embrace sort of my maximalist
Yeah.
tendencies.
Yeah.
Because within my work, I've sort of a while back started to really embrace kind of throwing it all in. Like in
Yeah.
grad school, again and again, people would be like, you don't have to put everything in one painting.
And you're like,
And then
"But
I was like, but why not, right?
Right.
You might only have this one painting.
Right.
So I love throwing everything into my paintings. But still, there are still large areas of raw canvas.
Yeah.
And so I think it's sort of it's having sort of both. But
Right.
I don't know. I've been trying to embrace more like in my home decorate. I'm like, oh, it'd be so nice if I was one of those people who could just have like a simple like wood bed and like a plant and like that's it. But like then I go to the thrift store and I see like 10 funny mugs and I'm like, well, I have to buy all of them.
Right.
They're all hilarious. Like,
yeah, why not? Right.
So I've just been trying to also be like okay with the fact that I like to have every kind of clashing pattern and tapestry and texture and every joke painting there is.
I think that's the secret, right? Is, you can do whatever you want.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
And hopefully everyone figures that out at some point,
Yeah.
So, and it's awesome when you figure it out.
Yeah.
It's like, hey, you don't have to ask anyone for permission. No one does. You can do whatever you want.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
but I do think it's a fine line because, so one of my kind of ongoing goals is to sort of make work that asks questions and work that deals with ideas of ambiguity, ideas of simultaneity, and ideas of things that are these sort of contradictory, simultaneous positions,
sure.
but to still be clear and direct about that. So how to be focused and direct about something that is not focused and direct. And I think that's kind of the tension that I try to play with in the work, is having pieces that can be complicated, but not so complicated that they set up like a barrier and you're like, I just can't deal with this.
That's not for me.
Yeah. So it's like, how do you be direct with ambiguity is sort of like the ongoing question I ask myself.
I think it's important to have something that holds your attention, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm interested in things that I can't quite figure out, things that I want to keep coming back to, and I don't know, I guess ideally get better at, as I journey out and collect knowledge and, come back to things and am different.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah. It's exciting to think about sort of how things can exist over time too, and as people's thoughts and ideas and I don't know what's on trend, what's off trend, like the way people talk about things. I think it's just it's so easy to kind of get caught up in the right now, and then you think like, well, what's it going to be like in 100 years to look at certain images, or 200 years or
yeah I just did this exercise where we were talking about ancestors, and going back, and part of the exercise was writing down your parents' names, writing down their parents' names, and then writing down their parents' names, and most people can't get all of those, and like virtually no one who I was with could get further than that. And the idea was like, look, in 3 generations people can't remember other people's names, so what kind of legacy do you want to have? So first we looked back, and then we were looking forward, and then it's like, what is long term for you? Is it 10 years? Is it 50 years? Is it 100 years? What happens in 150 years? What happens in 1,000 years? Like, what are the seeds that you can plant that you'll never experience yourself, but you think it's important for whoever comes next?
No, it's very interesting. I feel like I'm only just now starting to be like, oh yeah, way in the future. Because I love looking at the past. And I really like doing a lot of sort of family research and stuff. Like in grad school, I wrote a grant to get my Nana and I to Trinidad to do a bunch of family research, because I just find it really interesting. And so I'll think about the past, but the future, I won't be able to think much beyond like the current moment.
Yeah, most people can't.
Yeah.
And that's, most people are more comfortable kind of looking back, right? And or being present. But it's a great kind of mind bender to think about.
Yeah.
Because then it also forces you to deal with your own mortality, and that, right, is the only inevitable. So,
Yeah.
So I'm noticing a bunch of different quotes and whatnot on your studio walls.
Oh, yeah.
Will you talk about some of those?
Yeah, I mean, basically, this kind of comes from. I mean, I love writing, and I love puns and quoting and misquoting, and sort of taking snippets of text out of context and how that changes its meaning, or just not misspelling a word, but spelling a word phonetically, or spelling sort of like a word like morning. If you hear it in the context of like a song lyric, they usually are thinking about the time of day. But if you spell it with a U and write it down, it could become like grieving. Or like if you think about wake, has the same kind of idea, like being awake or being, again, like in the stage of grieving. But then you switch the tense to being woke, and then suddenly it's like it's very much in like right now, like this idea of wokeness. So just sort of like wordplay is something that I find interesting, and it's something that I think is sort of also how I think visually with things. Like I try to look for parts of the body that can mimic other parts of the body, or patterns that really sort of, depending on the context, would really shift from sort of high culture to low culture, or could kind of shift in its sort of shared legibility. So like if you see, I don't know, a plaid pattern, it could be very culturally specific or culturally vague, or it could be like fashion, or it could just be like a picnic blanket, or it could be some plastic reproduced textile that you'd find at like a dollar store that's a tablecloth. So I will write down snippets of text I find inspiring, that I would have in the past actually just drawn directly onto the canvas, but then I found that was sort of it was too tempting to want to see text next to an image and have it be the solution to the image.
Right.
And that was never my intention. So I mean, I like putting in little jokes and tricks and stuff, but I don't want to be ever like overly misleading with the work. Like it's not meant to fool anyone or like get anyone. So I'll write it down next to the work as sort of inspiration for me as I'm making the piece. And again, having this sort of environment that feeds back into the work. And then also it'll go into titles often for each piece.
Are you interested in confusion?
See, it's funny because it's like the work, I'm like really, I guess I'm interested in avoiding confusion.
Yeah.
Like I want to be as sort of like inconfusing. I would like to avoid confusion about things that are very complex. So I think I'm interested in complexity, but
not confusion.
But like taking out the confusion from that.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, that's interesting because it can be a productive space, but not if if it pushes people out.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So
it's always kind of a fine line though between the two. Like I'm not interested in things I'm not interested in being vague or confusing, but I think it's sort of it's like, I don't know. Yeah. It all is a bit confusing because it's sort of towing the line between always, for me, thinking about ways of like making an illegible state legible, or like finding a visual language that can explore something that I've found a lot of shortcomings with in actual language, or finding a visual language to describe something, a state of illegibility is what interests me. So it's like there's sort of this inherent contradiction
Yeah.
But I love contradictions, I guess.
So I was just going to ask, what do you like to do when you're not making art?
Well, right now, my new house, I like being in my house. I'm just hanging out with my cats and wife and fireplace. But I would say when I'm not making art, I'm usually doing like a few different things at once, which is why I really like making art, because it allows me to really focus on one thing. I was talking to my aunt whose son, my cousin, was taking figure drawing classes when he was like a teenager. And she was like, oh, it's great because he's like not on his phone when he's drawing from the model. And I was like, oh, that's so true. It's really, it's a space where when you're doing observational drawing, you're kind of not doing two things at once. You're just doing the one thing.
Yes.
Like you can't be on your phone texting while drawing. It's impossible.
Yeah.
So making art really is a wonderful time when I can just sort of fully concentrate on one thing. And then when I'm not making art, I'm usually like, you know, hosting a dinner party and like kind of checking my email and listening to music and gossiping about somebody with my friends. Like, I don't know. So it's always like 10 things at once that I'm doing.
Which is that's the contemporary time, right? So when you're making art and you're doing the one thing, do you find yourself like in a, like what would be called a flow state?
Well, I do. I mean, I find the flow state really interesting. I mean, I think that's sort of like one of the things that I think about as being this sort of an opportunity to sort of demystify an art making practice, because I've drawn or painted the figure pretty consistently since I was really young, because I took a figure drawing class when I was 12 that was like an adult, like nude figure drawing class. And I've sort of been, and I went to an arts high school in Los Angeles where they also had live nude models that we could draw from. And so I've really been consistently drawing the figure for, 34. So I've been consistently drawing it for like 22 years, which is long enough to really get those like 10,000 hours in that they talk about, like when you can start to be an expert at something. And I do think that like art really has this component of being like, what I love about it actually is that it's a technical skill that sort of transcends its technical aspects. And so, and I think the way that it has that transcendence is because it's rooted in the technical. And then when you put in those sort of 10,000 or so hours, you can actually, you're no longer thinking about the mechanics of what you're doing.
Right.
And it really allows for that flow state to enter where you can sort of let all these crazy ideas kind of coalesce into what you're doing. So for me, I can paint the figure kind of without thinking about painting the figure. And that allows for like every crazy thing that I've like read and seen and heard about in conversations I'm having, it can all kind of filter through the work. And I think that a lot of times that sort of can be seen as this sort of like, oh, this like unique genius quality that you're either born with or you're not. But I think you're sort of born with the desire to put in those initial 10,000 hours, and you're born with the ability to put in those 10,000 hours. So I was born to a circumstance where, you know, my mom was a single parent, working full time, and like dropping me off at Barnesdale Junior Art Park was kind of like the cheapest childcare that existed. So it was like, I would go there, or I'd like, you know, be after school with like nothing to do. And so I'd doodle all day. So it's sort of like, but I was in a creative family that gave me that opportunity. So it's sort of this combination of like, you have that drive to kind of self-motivate yourself, but then you also are given the opportunity to have access to like an arts education or the time. But then it's sort of through that you're able to access that flow state. And that's sort of like, that's actually when interesting, innovative connections can come through, is through practicing a technical skill. So I do find that to be a really wonderful state, and also sort of like, I don't know, it's like, I mean, it is like a privileged position to be able to have that, but it's also something that's not because you're like just born innately talented.
Right. Yeah, because you put in the time.
But it's also something that I try to sometimes interrupt and resist in my work. So like, I've been practicing having the flow state occur through observing the work rather than always making the work. So, because I think it's a fine line between flow state that's where you're actually accessing kind of like an interesting, innovative way of connecting ideas, and then having just habitual movements happen.
Right.
So, that comes into when I will resist connecting parts of the figure, and I'll take a step back and look at it. So I'm not just it's not always an application of the flow state.
That's super interesting. What do you think about intuition? Do you use intuition?
Yeah. I mean, I think it kind of goes back to that flow state idea. Yeah. So it's like, it's intuition that's been kind of crafted and honed and cultivated over years. And it's, I mean, one thing I've noticed is that since basically like before grad school, I never had the opportunity of painting 40 hours a week. And then during grad school and since grad school, I have. So now I've like just looked at a lot more art. And so I've really noticed that my ability to observe art has gotten a lot better. And it's just, as you see a skill develop, especially like, you know, when you're not a little kid and you are developing all your skills, it's like, I guess for me, observation has been a newer skill that I've been sort of honing and crafting. And so I guess, I don't know, with intuition, I think it's sort of like knowing to trust all the work that you've put into something rather than having it kind of come from some intangible, ethereal place. I think it really comes from sort of putting in a lot of actual tangible hours.
I like the idea of bringing that additional layer of consciousness to something that, you know, you've cultivated over all this time, but not just being comfortable there. Right. So it's like pushing yourself to in these spaces that are not necessarily uncomfortable, but, you know, less comfortable. Right. And seeing if some of the same tools can be employed, you know, in something that's related, but inherently different.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I mean, because I think that it's, you can get really hardwired to do certain things and that can be interesting, but I think it's always something you got to keep in check or be aware of that you're going to do it.
Well, and there's always a point, there's always an inflection point, right? And we don't know where it's going to be or when it's going to happen.
Right.
But I think somehow pushing into spaces that, you know, are tangential, I think maybe holds back, right? Like that idea of restraint again, like with that inflection point.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think also the idea with a restraint too, it's sort of, I mean, I think one of the more interesting things that art can do, whether you're making it or looking at it, is that it can sort of open up new pathways for things, and it can generate or spark some different, I think of it like, you know, like when you think about like a trail that gets formed over time, because it's like so many people walk on that same trail, and after a while it turns into a path, and then it can get paved and turn to a road. Like a lot of our roads are super weird because they just start off as walking trails. I mean, not in LA, but you know, somewhere out in the world. And so I think that art is sort of like a way that you can break away from that sort of like continued pathway that keeps getting reinforced the more and more people walk on it. And so it's really sort of important to try to break yourself from like those habits, because there's a likelihood you're going to keep on that trail when you let your mind sort of wander. And there's sort of like, I don't know, I think you can be in that flow state, but it can also easily be confused with sort of just being like lazy and going through the motions, like just kind of being set on autopilot. Exactly. And the two states are actually quite different in what they generate.
Yeah. I know exactly what you're talking about. And
so I'm constantly I guess it's like I'm constantly adding areas of restraint so that I can't just be on that autopilot. It's like you set up certain like firewalls, or I don't know what they'd be called. Like, probably not firewalls, but like you set up certain blocks, so you're forced to sort of renegotiate.
Yeah. So you just talked about one of the reasons why art matters, because it creates different paths, right? And opportunities and trajectories. Why else do you think art matters?
I mean, I really do think that that is one of the big ones for me. I mean, I remember being asked a lot in studio visits right after the 2016 election. Like people like were like questioning like, what's the role of art? Why does it matter? Like, shouldn't we be like going out and like canvassing and stuff?
Right.
And I do think that I think that art has like a lot of political potential, but I think it's actually like a really kind of indirect medium I think, let's see, how would I phrase this? Like, I think one of the problems we run into when we think about art as political is we think about art as a product instead of as a process. And so I think that if you think of art as a product, it's actually a really ineffective political tool because like graphic design is a lot more effective or like, visual propaganda. Like you can use visuals to create a political message, but there's really effective visual mediums for that. And art isn't necessarily that. It can be, but it's a lot harder to make it that. And I think that it's political power comes in its process. And so that's like the process of making and the process of looking. And that's where that idea of being able to kind of forge new pathways of thinking and new ways of putting together different ideas can come through in that process of art. And then in that, it's like actually a really powerful medium and something that like should continue to exist and like isn't frivolous and isn't silly.
Yeah.
Even if the result is, something that's completely abstract or completely like representational, but it's representational of like a vase of flowers. Like it's not about that. It's sort of about everything that goes into making that and then everything that goes into looking at that and sort of like just the way it makes you think differently, I think is its power.
I agree.
And then I think also the other part of it is the way that it can bring different people to a conversation. And it can be sort of like, it can be a conversation starter, or it can be something that can make people think about things that they wouldn't otherwise. I guess it positions you into a conversation within the conversation rather than outside of it, like we were saying before. And I think sort of then that part of it is sort of like where it's becomes a larger collective's like responsibility to access that, because that turns into having different people having access to art, feeling like art itself isn't a conversation that they shouldn't be having, like bringing different audiences to shows, different access to museums, different artists within those museum spaces. It's like that turns into something that's like bigger than an artist's role
of course.
In art making. But I think like an actual art object is sort of that process of thinking. So
what's one thing that you're excited about right now? Like in a broad way. Yeah.
Geez, it's bad I don't have an immediate answer. I'm like so excited about my new house. It's so selfish and it's like just about me. It's not going to affect anyone else. I'm excited about. I like just realized a few days ago that it's going to be a new decade. I don't know why it didn't occur to me.
Me too, actually.
But I was
Isn't
like,
that
wait,
weird?
it's going to be a whole new decade. Like, and I think it's just inevitable that we think about things in terms of decades. So I am excited about it being a new decade. I don't know if I'm always optimistic about it being a new decade, but I think it is exciting to just sort of be at the beginning of a new 10-year period. And I'm excited about, I guess I'm just excited about sort of like things inevitably always shifting and changing, and to kind of see what that next step is now that sort of like a lot of artists and people that haven't before had the opportunity to have a platform or a voice have been having that more and more, and sort of to see kind of where the next stage of that is, like what it means to have, artists in my generation moving into the next stage of their career, I think is exciting, because we've sort of just seen all these, women artists, people of color artists, queer artists, like get recognition later in their life. And so I think it's exciting to see a bunch of young artists like that, what they do sort of kind of as they get more and more sort of, as they start to become more mid-career artists. I think that'll be really exciting to see.
I love that idea, of just being excited about what we don't know.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So
yeah. That's the only thing it's like, what is my mom always is like the one thing we can be sure about is that everything changes.
Yeah.
It's like, all right, cool.
Yeah.
I guess that's good.
Well, and it's the idea that, we don't know what's going to happen really ever with anything. And if we approach it with like a conscious curiosity, like, hey, I'm really curious to see what's going to happen. Then I think that's, somehow tied to optimism and hope.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's exciting to see also like what the response is when more and more things become visible. Like I'm excited to see kind of what like the different reactions are, and like, not that I want to see like a ton of pushback against my work, but like I'm excited to sort of see the conversations that develop from that. And because I do feel like there's sort of sometimes a hesitancy to really put yourself out there, because there's so much sort of like, there's so many ways that you can kind of put your foot in your mouth these days and say something that's like not using the most up-to-date term or phrase or idea. And but I think there's actually like a lot that can come out of saying something with the hope that it's correct, and the knowledge that it won't be in like 10 minutes after you say it, after you put it out there. And that I think actually that pushback and that critique that can come from sort of trying your best and knowing that that's never going to be right, because we're still dealing with all the sloppiness of language and time and just the difficulty of making yourself as clear as you'd like to be. And but it's still like important to put yourself out there, because then you can have some younger person come around in 10 years and be like, here's all the ways that they were wrong, and I'm going to try to make it a little bit better. And it's like, keeps getting a little bit better.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I mean, I take, I don't know, solace or groundedness in intention, and just showing up with, intending to be present and do the right thing.
Yeah.
So
I mean, I think
with the information you have at the time, right?
Yeah.
So.
I think you should still be careful with what you say. I think that there's too much carelessness, but I think if the intention is coming from a good place, and then it's like you still probably will terribly fail, and you're going to come with your own shortcomings and your own privileges that are going to be completely blind to certain things that are going to be really obvious to a whole nother group of people. It's like, but I still think that will generate progress towards new ways of thinking, new ways of speaking.
And I mean, often people don't know what they don't know, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And
you kind of don't know it until you say it, and you're like, oh my God.
Yeah.
I was really wrong about that.
Well, and it's also, I talked about this, when I did this podcast with Seth Price, but I learned this term like cottywomple, and it just means, like moving, through like the complexities of time, just forward, right?
Yeah.
And, you're sort of baltering and, probably like going to trip or like bump into something or, and you just keep going.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. I mean, because it's always easier to work on like a second draft of something, It's like that first draft is so hard.
Yeah. Well, and it's also, I mean, I think there's a sense of grace that comes with, like, saying, I wish I did that differently. And I will next time.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, no, I think it's having that openness to being able to change.
Yeah.
And reassess too. I try to always do that. Like, I try to always sort of write an account for like who I am, what my work is, and then be like, okay, cool. And now I'm going to rewrite it
Yeah.
and rethink it.
And share it,
Yeah.
because I've found that when I leave something in my head,
Mhm.
it has a limited capacity.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
For influence, for, everything,
Yeah.
exposure. And when I put it out there, even if it's like, mismatched or, whatever it is,
Yeah.
then, it gets stronger through feedback.
Yeah, exactly.
So, yeah.
So I guess I'm excited about seeing all of that. Everyone's first and second and third drafts of everything.
Yeah. Thank you so much for talking with me today. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so
for
much.
welcoming me into your studio, too.
Yeah. Thanks for coming by.
My pleasure. Conversations About Art is part of Heidi.art. This episode was produced by Simon Illa. Our theme music was composed by Eric McDougall. Jordan Weisberg is our curatorial associate. If you like what you heard, please subscribe and review us on whichever platform you listened, as it helps us further our goal of connecting all to art. We'll be back again every other Tuesday with new episodes. Thanks for listening.